When my uncle was president, 3% of American kids had chronic disease. Today, it's around 60%. And these are a broad category, the ones that Marty mentioned, like ADHD, the neurological disorders, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, and autism. All of these are injuries that I never heard of when I was a kid. They were not part of the nomenclature. They weren't part of the dialogue. There was zero spent in this country treating chronic disease when my uncle was president. Today, it's about $1.8 trillion annually. It's bankrupting our nation.
The first 100 days of making America great again, but there's more to MAGA than there was perhaps the first time around, because folks realize, and I think know, that the MAGA coalition does not just include those of us who were sort of the core MAGA there at the beginning 10 years ago. No, it's expanded. There's so many more people involved now. And one of the biggest groups that's come in that has partnered with MAGA, of course, is MAHA. So now, not only have we seen 100 days of making America great again, but in fact, we've seen 100 days of making America healthy again. Something that, like, I just keep saying this, MAHA is the most popular political movement in America today. This is something that transcends the aisle. This is something that goes beyond parties. It certainly goes beyond personalities. And just like MAGA, it does also have an incredibly powerful personality at the helm of it. And that, of course, is RFK. So I said, I want to talk about MAHA today because I don't know that anybody else will, so someone has to do it. And so to do so, I wanted to get on the host of American Gravy. That is Chef Andrew Gruel. You may know him. He's also a city councilman in Huntington Beach. What's up, Andrew?
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Love talking MAHA. Let's do this.
Well, so when you look at the first 100 days, what really jumps out at you? You know, we've certainly seen a lot of restructuring. We've seen a lot of the conversation shift on so many of these issues. And to me, just from my perspective, it's, you know, and even with my wife, Tanya loves the MAHA issue. This is something that has just been a sawhorse for hers for a very long time. She comes from outside the country. So when she moved to the United States, she said, what is wrong with your food? She grew up in Europe. She said, your food, something is wrong, it doesn't taste real, etc. And, you know, now, and years ago, those types of concerns used to get pushed to the side. They say there's something wrong with you. The studies don't show that, et cetera, et cetera. Studies say the food is fine. Now it's front and center. So we've seen that huge push, but what about specifically from the MAHA movement reflected in government have we seen in these 100 days?
The MAHA-MAGA movement, I think, is one of the strongest coalitions we've seen in politics in over 100 years. Nicole Shanahan has repeated this. Obviously, she was an architect of a lot of it. And what I've seen is almost something that's happened in two stages, right? So there was the pre-election MAHA-MAGA movement, and that was about building awareness, right? Just explaining to every single citizen of the United States, where does your food come from? Why have you been sick, et cetera? Explaining how, and a lot of this was driven by like Callie Means and that coalition, you know, how the lobbyists have paid for the research, which pays for the headlines, which teaches people about how they eat, and then how the government stitches themselves into it. And it just becomes this massive coalition between the government and some of these big food manufacturers. And then they're all in it to get people sick, to really force feed us cheap food and import a lot of food. And I think that's where the tariff piece also comes into this. So everyone was aware of it. And I saw that by virtue of my restaurants. Hundreds of guests were coming in asking, where does this come from? What type of fats are you using to cook this, right? Are you using any local farms, local seafood? In my 20 years of owning and operating restaurants, this is the only time I've had such a large group of people asking questions like that. Now let's go past the into the first 100 days. They got rid of the Gross loophole. The Gross loophole was the biggest hurdle in all of this, because that's generally recognized as safe. That's how all the food manufacturers have slipped these questionable chemicals into our foods. And originally, GRAS was supposed to be for things like flour and sugar and salt and vinegars, things that we understand are safe and they don't need too much scientific research. And then they started stitching into that the food dyes and all the chemicals that we see on the back of the packaging. Now, in other countries, when you look at the back of their packaging and you only see a few ingredients, it's because they haven't been slipped in through that GRAS loophole. So Kennedy got rid of that immediately. And then we started to see the movement happen on a state level, right? State legislation saying we're not going to use SNAP benefits to give
GRAS
kids
is,
soda and
by
junk
the way,
food.
I want to, for the folks out there, the GRAS, that's generally recognized as safe. And that's just this
Yep.
sort of like vague loophole where it's almost like you don't have to say it's safe. You can say it's generally recognized as safe. That's crazy, by the way. That's like
Yeah.
emotional linguistic manipulation.
And then if the food manufacturer produces like one study by their own team or even their interns to say, oh, we think it's safe, then that kind of justifies pushing it through the GRAS loophole. So it's been this real, incestual, circle of information and propaganda between the government and a lot of these food companies utilizing their own research. Now, the government underwrites a lot of this research that then those food corporations use to get it back into the food system. So what RFK has done, the second piece, is cutting a lot of that research, that infected research that's paid for by the same people that are pushing those products, right? So we can actually get the right information out there to the consumers. Now, that's going to apply to both food and vaccines and medicines. So kind of breaking up some of that big pharma hold on not just the food system, but just medicine in general. So that's a huge piece of this. And he's already fractured that, which is why we're seeing so much hand wringing, ironically, from the left. The people that love the big corporations now, the people that love big pharma. Bernie's out there talking about how big pharma was corrupt, but he's the same guy shilling all their products. And then when RFK breaks it up, he says, oh my gosh, we can't have this. So it's unbelievable how things have flipped in 10 years. And then the third piece of this, like I was mentioning, was the state legislatures, right? Where the states are saying, hey, we're not going to use SNAP benefits and we're not going to use all of this federal money as well as state money to feed kids junk, right? We're not going to use that to give them junk food and sodas. We're going to give them real food. And that's about cutting those SNAP benefits so that you can actually use those benefits to give people real food and not get the kids addicted to sodas and sugars. Now, that's been a movement that's come down, and the state legislators have taken hold of that. Places like Arizona, and once again, Callie Means has been the architect behind that from End Chronic Disease, and he's pushing it through all these different states. So, I mean, that is so much. That's almost 40 or 50 years of bad work that's been undone in 100 days by virtue of this coalition.
I mean, that's incredible. The things that you're talking about, this is like, it's sort of, there's been this sort of meme going around that esoteric group chats have really been leading towards Trump's executive orders. But that is kind of what it is, almost like these are just conversations that, and I'll tell you the reason I'll go back to this, pre-election, how I knew MAHA was real. And you mentioned your restaurant. My sort of touch point has always been my wife with this. And I catch her and she's in the kitchen and I look over her shoulder a little bit and she's listening to a podcast and I'm like, oh, that's cool. Yeah. What are you listening to? And I see she's listening to Joe Rogan. And I'm like, you don't usually listen to Rogan. What are you listening to, sweetheart? I'm like, that's cool, and it was RFK. And I said, what made you want to listen to that one? And she goes, every single mom in my mom's chat is talking about this. And that was back, it started with COVID, but then of course it moved into other areas. And she said, they're all talking about it. And it really was this holistic approach. And I said, wait a minute. None of those people are political. It's like one of the mom's group chats. And I said, something politically, I put my political hat on here, say, you know what? This is the way to reach out to suburban women in a way that I don't think the Republicans or conservatives have ever even considered before.